My name is Michael. I'm in my early 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked inside systems that reward calm reliability and punish unnecessary noise. I've never been the loudest voice in the room. I'm not the one people expect to shake things up. If you asked my coworkers to describe me before all this happened, they'd probably say dependable, quiet, maybe even a little forgettable. The kind of person who always delivers, doesn't complain, and doesn't need much managing. And that perception, being underestimated, used to feel neutral to me, almost comfortable. There's a strange safety in being seen as harmless. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing villains or proving I was secretly brilliant all along. It's about a slow realization, one that unfolded quietly, the way most real turning points do. It's about noticing something small that didn't feel right, choosing not to react emotionally and letting clarity, not anger, guide what came next. What you're about to hear is a first-person account of how trust erodes not through dramatic betrayals, but through subtle overreach. How silence can be mistaken for ignorance, and how power doesn't always announce itself when it shifts hands. There were no explosive confrontations at first. No raised voices, no walkouts, just patterns, logs, timestamps, and a growing sense that something about my workplace, something I had consented to in good faith, was not what it appeared to be. I want to be clear about one thing from the start. I didn't go looking for a fight. I didn't even go looking for proof. I was trying to understand my own unease, the kind you can't quite explain to friends because it sounds paranoid when you say it out loud, the kind you almost talk yourself out of. This story moves slowly on purpose because that's how it happened, step by step, observation by observation. Each part builds on the last, not with drama, but with accumulation. And by the time the truth surfaced, it didn't feel shocking. It felt inevitable. If you're expecting a story where someone storms into a boardroom and demands justice, this isn't that. This is about quiet dominance, the kind that comes from preparation, documentation, and restraint. From knowing when not to speak, from letting systems reveal themselves. I'm sharing this not to position myself as a hero, but because I know I'm not the only one who's ever felt watched, dismissed, or quietly crossed at work and wondered if they were imagining it. So as you listen, I'd like you to hold one simple question with you, not for me, but for yourself. Have you ever ignored a small discomfort because everyone else seemed perfectly fine with it? To them, I was reliable. That word followed me everywhere inside the company. It showed up in performance reviews, in Slack messages, in the tone managers used when they assigned me work they didn't want to think about again. Michael will handle it. Michael's solid. If it needs to be done right, give it to Michael. It sounded like praise, and for a long time I accepted it as such. I worked as an operations analyst, but that title never really captured what I did day to day. I filled gaps, I translated vague ideas into processes. I caught mistakes before they reached clients. When systems failed quietly at 2 a.m, I was often the one who noticed first. Not because I was told to, but because I paid attention. What I wasn't known for was visibility. I didn't dominate meetings, I didn't fight for airtime. When I spoke, it was usually after listening for a long time. And even then, I chose my words carefully. Not because I lacked confidence, but because I had learned early in my career that men who spoke too precisely, too persistently, were often labeled intense, or worse, difficult. So I adapted. I became efficient instead of expressive, accurate instead of loud, useful instead of memorable, less visible, less interpretable, easier to place. And the company loved that version of me. In group settings, my presence was almost assumed rather than acknowledged. People would reference work I had done without saying my name, as if it had simply appeared. Decisions would be made that relied on my systems, my documentation, my cleanup. But I wasn't invited into the room where those decisions happened. At first, I told myself this was fine. Preferably, even. I liked working without constant scrutiny. I liked not being pulled into office politics. There was a quiet pride in knowing things ran smoothly because I was there, even if no one said it out loud. But invisibility has a key. When you're seen as dependable but not central, people stop asking for your consent. They stop explaining changes. They assume access because you've never objected before, and I had never objected. Not when software was installed without much explanation. Not when security policies were updated with dense language and tight deadlines. Not when new productivity tools appeared, framed as harmless improvements. I skimmed, I complied, I moved on. That was the role I'd been practicing for years. Trust the system, do your job, don't make waves. Looking back, I can see how carefully that role was shaped, not by a single person, but by a culture. A culture that rewarded quiet labor and discouraged questioning unless it came from the right titles. In meetings, I was the one taking notes while others debated strategy. In retrospectives, my name came up in phrases like supporting role or behind the scenes. No one ever asked if that was how I wanted to be seen. And I never corrected them. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who rely on you but don't really look at you. You're present but interchangeable. Trusted but not consulted. Still, I stayed. I told myself that stability mattered, that not every job had to be a platform. The competence was its own reward. What I didn't realize then was how that perception, quiet, compliant, low risk, would later shape the choices others felt entitled to make around me. Because when people believe you won't push back, they stop checking where the lines are. And at that stage of my life, I hadn't yet learned that being underestimated doesn't just hide your strength. It invites intrusion. The first thing that felt wrong was so minor, I almost dismissed it out of habit. It wasn't a confrontation, no email, no warning, just a moment. I was working late one evening, trying to trace an inconsistency in a report that had been flagged by leadership earlier that day. It wasn't urgent in the formal sense, but I felt responsible for it. That was my default setting. If something was broken, I stayed until I understood why. At some point, my laptop fan kicked up harder than usual. I remember noticing it because nothing I was running should have been that heavy. No simulations, no exports, just a browser, a spreadsheet, and a terminal window I used for light queries. Still, the system monitor showed short, sharp spikes. Activity that didn't line up with what I was doing. I stared at the screen for a few seconds longer than necessary. Then I did what I had trained myself to do over years of corporate life. I rationalized. Maybe it was an update, maybe some background sync, maybe I was tired and overthinking it. I saved my work, shut the laptop, and went home. The next morning, I mentioned it casually to a coworker while we waited for coffee. I didn't frame it as a concern. I laughed it off even. Ever feel like your machine is working harder than you are? They shrugged. IT stuff, probably security scans, happens all the time. That should have been the end of it, except it happened again and again. Always subtle. Always just enough to notice, never enough to prove. A flicker of screen lag when I wasn't doing anything intensive. A brief cursor stutter. Once, a notification tray icon appeared for a split second and vanished before I could read it. Each time, I felt the same internal tug of war. Part of me wanted to look closer. The other part, the louder, more conditioned part, whispered that paying too much attention would make me seem paranoid, unprofessional, difficult. So I stayed quiet. I told myself that if something truly inappropriate was happening, it would be obvious. There would be an announcement, a policy update, a consent form. Companies didn't just watch people. Not without telling them, not without risk. That belief wasn't naive. It was learned, reinforced by years of HR trainings about transparency and trust, by carefully worded documents that emphasized respect and compliance. And yet, something didn't sit right. One afternoon during a routine team check-in, our manager mentioned, almost offhandedly, that IT had been rolling out enhanced monitoring tools to improve performance insights across departments. No one reacted. A few people nodded. Someone joked about finally catching the person who hogged bandwidth on Fridays. The conversation moved on. I wrote the phrase down in my notes, underlined twice. Enhanced monitoring. Still, I didn't ask a question. Not then, not later. I waited for a follow-up email that never came. I checked internal documentation portals. Nothing new, no clarifications, no explicit descriptions of what monitoring meant in practice. That absence bothered me more than the tools themselves. But discomfort is easy to ignore when everyone else seems comfortable. When no one else is pausing, you start to wonder if the pause is the problem. So I told myself a familiar story. This was normal. This was corporate life. And I was reading too much into it. What I didn't know then was that this was the smallest cut. The kind that doesn't bleed but weakens the skin just enough to make the next one easier. Once something strange happens more than once, it stops feeling strange. That's how normalization works, not through acceptance, but through repetition. The mind adapts, the body learns not to react. And slowly the threshold for what feels off begins to shift. After that first week, the irregularities became part of the background noise of my workday. My laptop is running warm when it shouldn't. Network activity spikes at odd hours. Occasional delays when waking the screen. Like something else had been there just a moment before I arrived. I noticed them. I always noticed. But I also learned how to file them away without examining them too closely. I was busy. We were understaffed. Everyone was stretched thin. Those were the explanations I fed myself because they were reasonable and socially acceptable. No one wants to be the person who slows things down with uncomfortable questions, especially when those questions don't come with proof. And I had no proof, just patterns. There's a particular kind of disrespect that doesn't look like hostility. It looks like an omission, like decisions made without you, even though they affect you directly, like information shared in vague terms, so no one technically lies, but no one fully understands either. That's what this felt like. Policies were updated with language that sounded comprehensive, but explained very little. Phrases like operational visibility and workflow optimization appeared more often. The words were neutral, almost comforting, but they weren't concrete. I found myself rereading sections of internal guidelines, looking for clarity that never came. Each time I'd stop, shake my head, and move on. There was always more work to do. Another deadline, another request. At some point, I realized I had stopped expecting transparency. That realization didn't come with anger. It came with resignation. This is just how it is, I thought. Companies grow, tools get more intrusive. You either accept it or you leave. And leaving felt dramatic, premature, unnecessary. So I stayed quiet. And in doing so, I participated in my own erasure. I stopped mentioning the anomalies, even casually. I didn't want to be that person. The one who fixates. The one who needs reassurance. Instead, I leaned harder into competence. If I couldn't control what was happening around me, I could at least control the quality of my output. Ironically, that made me more trusted. My manager began assigning me sensitive projects. Access expanded, responsibilities increased. I was praised for discretion, for being low maintenance, for not overreacting when things changed quickly. Each compliment reinforced the same unspoken expectation. Don't question, just adapt. There were moments, small, fleeting, when I almost spoke up. When I hovered over the send button on a message to IT, when I drafted a neutral inquiry and then deleted it. What would I even ask? Are you recording my screen without telling me? The thought sounded absurd, even to me, so I rationalized the silence. Told myself that if something crossed the line, it would be obvious. That my discomfort was just the friction of modern work. That everyone else was dealing with the same thing and simply coping better. But deep down, something had shifted. I had started to feel like my work environment wasn't fully mine anymore. Like I was a guest at my own desk. Trusted with responsibility, but not with information. That feeling didn't explode into action. It settled, and in settling, it taught me a dangerous lesson. That enduring quiet disrespect was easier than naming it. It took time for me to see it clearly, but once I did, I couldn't unsee it. I had been assigned a role, quietly, informally, without discussion, and I had been performing it perfectly. I was the stabilizer, the one who absorbed uncertainty so others didn't have to, the one who adapted when systems changed overnight, the one who never asked for extra explanations, because everyone assumed I didn't need them, or wouldn't want them. When something new was introduced, I was expected to figure it out. When something broke, I was expected to fix it. When ambiguity appeared, it landed in my lap. That's by default. And because I never pushed back, that expectation hardened into identity. I started noticing how people interacted with me differently from how they interacted with others. Not unkindly, just efficiently. Conversations with me skipped the preamble. Instructions were shorter, context was thinner. There was an assumption that I would get it without needing to be told. At first, that felt like trust. Later, it felt like entitlement. I wasn't included in early discussions about tooling changes, even though I would be responsible for their downstream impact. I wasn't asked how new systems affected my workflow. I was simply expected to adjust. Reliable people, I realized, are often treated as infrastructure. You don't ask infrastructure how it feels. You just rely on it to work. The monitoring tools, whatever they were, became part of that same pattern. Rolled out above my head, explained in an abstract language. Never personalized, never contextualized. And I understood finally why no one thought to loop me in. Because in their minds, I wasn't someone who needed reassurance or consent. I was someone who would comply quietly and continue delivering results. I had trained them to see me that way. There was no single moment where someone explicitly said, "You don't get a say." It was subtler than that. It was the absence of invitation, the lack of detail, the way questions were redirected or answered vaguely when they came from people like me. Meanwhile, others, more vocal, more visible, received briefings, walkthroughs, reassurances framed as transparency. I watched this happen without comment, because part of me still believed that speaking up would cost more than staying silent. But another part of me was beginning to take notes. Not formally, not yet, just mentally. I noticed who was informed and who wasn't, who asked questions and who was indulged, who stayed quiet and who was rewarded for it. And I noticed myself, how I sat in meetings slightly back from the table, how I filled silence with clarification instead of challenge, how I nodded when things didn't make sense, trusting that clarity would come later. It rarely did. That was when I understood the role fully. Reliable, useful, invisible. Not powerless, but presumed non-threatening. And that presumption created a dangerous comfort for the people making decisions. Comfort enough to blur lines. Comfort enough to assume consent where none had been given. I didn't confront anyone about this realization. I didn't change my behavior outwardly. But internally, something hardened, not into anger, but into awareness. If this was the role they had assigned me, then I needed to understand its limits. And more importantly, what happened when those limits were crossed. The shift didn't happen during a meeting, or after a conversation, or because someone finally said the wrong thing. It happened in silence, on an ordinary afternoon that should have passed without meaning. I was working from home that day, the kind of quiet stretch where hours slip by unnoticed. The task in front of me was routine, data reconciliation, nothing urgent, nothing sensitive. I remember this clearly because it mattered later. There was no reason for heightened attention, no reason for scrutiny. At one point, I stepped away from my desk to make tea. When I came back, my screen was awake. Not unlocked, just awake. The cursor blinked in a field I hadn't clicked into. The window arrangement was the same, but something about it felt interrupted. Like I had walked into a room mid-conversation and everyone had gone silent. I stood there for a moment, hands still on the mug, and didn't touch the keyboard. I waited. Nothing moved, no pop-ups, no alerts, just my desktop, exactly as I'd left it, except for that one detail. The system uptime indicator showed activity during the minutes I had been away. That was the moment my internal narrative broke. Up until then, I had been explaining things away. Updates, scans, automation. But this didn't fit. Not cleanly, not comfortably. I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. The kind that arrives when you stop asking, am I overreacting? And start asking, what would I need to know to be sure? I closed my laptop without saving anything and sat there longer than necessary, just thinking. Not spiraling, not panicking. Thinking methodically. If nothing inappropriate was happening, then verifying that would be easy. If something was happening, then reacting emotionally would only make it harder to understand. So I chose a third option. I chose patience. That evening, instead of venting to a friend or drafting a concerned email, I opened a private notebook. Not a digital one, a physical notebook I rarely used, the kind that doesn't leave metadata behind. I wrote down what I had observed: time, behavior, my own actions, no conclusions, no accusations, just facts. It felt strange at first, almost excessive. But as I wrote, I felt something else settle in: control. For the first time, I wasn't trying to convince myself that everything was fine. I was allowing the possibility that it wasn't, and giving myself permission to find out quietly. That day didn't change how I acted at work. I still showed up to meetings, still responded promptly, still played my role. But internally, the script had changed. I stopped assuming good faith by default, not because I had lost trust, but because trust without verification had already failed me once. From that point on, silence wasn't avoidance. It was a decision. Once silence becomes intentional, it changes texture. Before, my quietness had been passive, an absence of resistance, a habit formed by years of navigating systems that didn't reward questions. Now it was deliberate, measured, protective. Nothing about my external behavior shifted enough to raise suspicion. That was important. I still responded to messages with the same tone. I still attended meetings and contributed when asked. I still met every deadline. If anything, I became more consistent. People read that consistency as compliance. They mistook my lack of questions for comfort, my calm for agreement, my continued productivity for trust. And I let them. Internally, though, I began drawing lines. Not lines anyone else could see, but ones that shaped how I paid attention. I noted when my machine behaved oddly and when it didn't. I paid closer attention to patterns: time of day, network usage, system processes that appeared and disappeared too quickly to be a coincidence. I didn't intervene, I observed. There's a difference between suspicion and vigilance. Suspicion looks for confirmation of a fear. Vigilance collects information without deciding what it means yet. That distinction mattered to me. I didn't want to be right. I wanted to be accurate. So I resisted the urge to jump ahead. I didn't install tools that would alter my system state. I didn't run scans that could be detected. I didn't confront IT or management with vague discomfort. Instead, I let the environment continue as it was. And in doing so, I learned something important. When people believe you are not paying attention, they stop being careful. Over time, the anomalies became more predictable. Short bursts of activity during meetings I wasn't presenting in. Increased system load when my screen was idle. Network usage that correlated too neatly with my login sessions to be random. Still, nothing overt. Nothing that would alarm a casual user. That was the point. Whatever was happening wasn't designed to scare. It was designed to be invisible. And invisibility depends on an assumption. They assumed I wouldn't notice. Or if I did, that I wouldn't understand. Or if I understood, that I wouldn't challenge it. Every assumption rested on the same foundation: the role they believed I played. Reliable, quiet, low risk. I continued to fulfill that role while slowly reclaiming something I hadn't realized I'd given up: agency. Not through confrontation, but through restraint. There were days when I wanted to break the silence, when the unfairness of not being informed, not being asked, pressed heavily. But each time I reminded myself, clarity first, reaction later, if at all. Silence in this phase wasn't submission, it was positioning. And while no one else noticed the shift, it changed the trajectory of everything that followed. What they never noticed was how much I was already equipped to see. My job had trained me to think in systems: inputs, outputs, logs, dependencies. When something behaved unexpectedly, I didn't ask who was at fault. I asked where the signal came from and where it went next. So I applied that same mindset to my own environment, quietly. I didn't install anything new. I didn't announce what I was doing. I simply began using what was already there. Tools that any technically literate employee could access if they knew where to look and had the patience to interpret what they saw. System logs, network activity summaries, process histories. Nothing invasive, nothing illegal, just observation. I started small. I noted timestamps when my laptop showed unexplained spikes. I compared them with my calendar. Meetings, breaks, periods of inactivity. Patterns emerged, not dramatic ones, but consistent ones. The activity didn't align with software updates. It didn't align with backups. It didn't align with anything I had been told. So I documented, not obsessively, methodically. Each entry had a date, a time, and a description. No speculation, no emotional language, just what happened and what I was doing or not doing at the time. This wasn't about building a case yet. It was about understanding the scope. What surprised me most was how easy it was to do this unnoticed. No one checked in, no alerts were triggered, no one asked why I was suddenly more interested in system behavior. Because from the outside, nothing had changed. I was still the same Michael, still reliable, still quiet, still delivering. That's the paradox of being underestimated. You're granted freedom through neglect. Over the following weeks, I learned how deep that freedom went. I noticed remote session indicators that appeared briefly and then vanished. I noticed processes that matched known enterprise monitoring tools. Tools I recognized not because I was told about them, but because I had encountered similar ones in past projects. The realization wasn't immediate. It layered itself slowly, like fog lifting in stages. This wasn't generic monitoring. It was interactive. Someone or something was seeing what I saw when I saw it. And they had never asked. I remember the moment that truth settled. Not with shock, but with a strange calm. The kind that comes when ambiguity finally resolves into something solid. Still, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't even tell myself what I would do if my suspicions were confirmed. I kept documenting. Because the most powerful thing about preparation is that it doesn't require certainty, only consistency. And all the while they continued as before, confident, unconcerned, operating under the assumption that the quiet one wasn't watching back. They never noticed the notebook, never noticed the careful cross-referencing, never noticed that silence had become discipline. By the time I understood what was happening, I also understood something else. I wasn't late to this discovery. I was exactly on time. The private reveal didn't arrive as a single file or a dramatic gotcha moment. It arrived as alignment. Weeks of notes, logs, and timestamps began to sit on top of each other in a way that removed doubt. Not suspicion, doubt. The difference mattered. Suspicion still leaves room for denial. Doubt disappearing leaves only responsibility. I remember the night it fully clicked. I was reviewing entries from different days, spread across my desk. Handwritten notes, exported summaries, system snapshots taken minutes apart. I wasn't looking for anything new. I was verifying consistency. And there it was, a recurring process initiating remote frame capture during specific windows, always when I was logged in, always when my screen was active, never during idle lock. The activity aligned precisely with internal meeting blocks where I was not presenting, not sharing my screen, and not required to be observed. Yet I was. I checked again, then again, different days, same behavior. This wasn't passive logging. This wasn't keystroke counts or application usage metrics. This was visual access. My screen recorded without consent, without disclosure, without a policy language that described it honestly. I sat back in my chair and let the weight of that settle. Not emotionally, but ethically. Because once you name something accurately, it changes how you're allowed to respond to it. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel afraid. I felt precise. There's a strange calm that comes when a situation becomes legible. When you stop asking what is happening and start asking, what does this obligate me to do? I didn't rush to tell anyone, not my manager, not HR, not legal. I didn't even write an email draft. Instead, I refined. I organized the logs into a clean timeline. I annotated nothing beyond what was objectively verifiable. No accusations, no assumptions about intent. Just evidence, timestamps, process IDs, correlation with my activity, and the absence of any consent mechanism. I also checked the documentation again. Every internal policy, every onboarding agreement, every update notice. I highlighted what was missing, not what was misleading, what was absent. That absence was the leverage. Not because I wanted power over anyone, but because clarity creates obligation. And obligation shifts dynamics. By the end of that process, I knew something important. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be brushed away with reassurance. It was a boundary violation that required acknowledgement. But acknowledgement, I realized, didn't have to come from confrontation. It could come from timing. So I closed the folder, I locked the notebook away, and I went to bed. The reveal had already happened, privately, internally. Everything after this would be about how and when to let others catch up. Once you know something with certainty, indecision becomes its own kind of action. I spent several days doing nothing outwardly different, but internally I was weighing paths, not emotionally, strategically. Each option had consequences, not just for me, but for how the truth would be framed once it left my control. I could go directly to my manager. I could file a complaint with HR. I could consult an external lawyer quietly. I could even resign and walk away, carrying the knowledge with me and letting silence swallow it whole. Each option felt clean on the surface. None of them felt complete. Going to my manager would make it interpersonal. It would invite explanations, justifications, maybe even apologies, but also pressure to resolve this internally. I would be framed as a problem to be managed, not a boundary that had been crossed. HR would slow everything down. They would ask for summaries, not sources, feelings, not facts. And HR's job, despite what people like to believe, is not to arbitrate morality. It's to manage risk. Walking away would protect my peace in the short term, but it would also reward the very assumption that had allowed this to happen, that people like me would stay quiet and absorb the cost. I wasn't interested in punishment. I wasn't interested in drama. I was interested in acknowledgement. So I chose the option that felt irreversible but proportionate. I prepared to make the truth undeniable without making myself the center of it. That meant waiting. I waited for a moment when my role couldn't be minimized, when my contribution mattered enough that dismissal wasn't convenient, when my credibility was already established in the room. That moment came sooner than expected. A cross-department audit was scheduled, routine on paper, high stakes in practice. Leadership wanted clarity on workflow inefficiencies, system usage, and compliance alignment. The kind of meeting where numbers mattered more than narratives. I was asked to prepare background documentation. Of course I was. That's when I made my decision. I didn't add accusations, I didn't make claims, I simply included a supplemental appendix, clearly labeled, professionally formatted, and impossible to ignore. Time-stamped logs, process identifiers, a clean comparison between declared policy and observed behavior. No commentary, just facts. I knew once that document was seen, the conversation would no longer be about whether something felt wrong. It would be about why it happened and who knew. That choice closed the door on going back to ignorance. But it also preserved something important. My composure. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was acting. From the outside, nothing happened. That was the point. The week after I submitted the audit materials looked exactly like every other week I'd worked there. Same calendar rhythm, same tone in meetings, same measured responses in chat. If anyone was watching for a reaction, anxiety, defensiveness, a shift in posture, they didn't get one. Silence, when used deliberately, doesn't draw attention. It creates a vacuum, and people fill vacuums with assumptions. They assumed I was still just doing my job. Internally, though, I had moved into a different phase, one where preparation gave way to alignment, where each small action served a larger shape, even if no single step looked significant on its own. The appendix I'd included in the audit wasn't framed as a complaint. It wasn't even framed as an issue. It was contextual data, operational clarity, the kind leadership always claimed to value. That framing mattered more than I realized at the time, because once information is presented as infrastructure rather than emotion, it becomes harder to dismiss without revealing intent. I didn't follow up. That restraint confused people. Normally, when someone submits supplemental material, they hover, they check in, they ask whether it was reviewed. I did none of that. I went quiet in a way that felt natural, not evasive. If someone had asked me directly why I included those logs, I was ready to answer calmly, and factually. But no one did. Not yet. What did happen was subtler. IT scheduled routine maintenance on multiple systems the following week, not announced widely, just calendar blocks appearing here and there. Security documentation portals were quietly updated. Language was added, clarified, expanded, not retroactive, prospective. That detail that didn't escape me. You don't update policy language unless someone has noticed the gap. Still, I said nothing. I didn't want to be the loudest signal in the room. I wanted to be the baseline. During this time, I also began protecting myself in ways that had nothing to do with confrontation. I reviewed my employment agreement carefully. I cross-checked it against updated policies. I made sure I understood my rights not emotionally but procedurally. There's a difference between preparing to fight and preparing to stand. I wasn't arming myself, I was grounding myself. I ensured that my personal work artifacts were properly backed up. Nothing confidential, nothing proprietary, just records of my own contributions and timelines. I made sure my documentation trails were clean and professional. If anyone were to review my work history, they'd find consistency, not defensiveness. And still, I said nothing. The silence began to change how others behaved around me. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. Meetings that once moved briskly now paused when I spoke. Questions that used to be brushed aside were answered more carefully. I wasn't suddenly deferred to, but I was no longer skimmed over. It was as if the room had recalibrated me without knowing why. That's the thing about quiet leverage. It doesn't announce itself. It alters probabilities. Somewhere between submission and rebellion, there's a third position. One where you let systems respond to the truth on their own terms. And systems always respond. I received a message from IT one afternoon. Polite, neutral, almost friendly. They wanted to check in about my workflow experience with recent tooling changes. I read it twice. Then I waited. Not out of fear, out of intention. I responded the next morning with a brief acknowledgement. I didn't mention concerns. I didn't ask questions. I simply confirmed availability and thanked them for reaching out. That reply did more than any accusation could have, because it forced them to speak first. In the days that followed, the conversations began happening without me in the room, but I could feel their effects. Slight delays, rescheduled meetings, a new layer of caution in how people reference monitoring tools. No one apologized. No one admitted anything yet. But the ground had shifted, and still, I didn't move. This phase was about letting consequences begin organically without me pushing them into existence. About allowing the system to reveal how it handled being observed. I often think about how easy it would have been to confront someone earlier, to demand answers, to escalate emotionally, but that would have centered me as the problem. By staying silent now, I was centering the behavior itself. There's power in that distinction. Silence, when misunderstood as weakness, invites exposure. People relax. They assume the moment has passed, that urgency has faded. They forget that documentation doesn't forget. By the time anyone realized I wasn't going to let it go, it was already too late to reframe the narrative. Because I hadn't reacted. I had recorded, and systems respond very differently to records than they do to feelings. The consequences didn't arrive loudly, and they didn't arrive all at once. They arrived the way pressure changes weather. Slowly, subtly, in ways you only notice if you're paying attention to patterns instead of moments. At first, it was just friction. Things that had once moved smoothly began to hesitate. Approvals that used to come back the same day now linger. Requests that normally passed through 2 hands started looping through 4. People began adding others to emails just to be safe, even when it wasn't strictly necessary. No one framed this as a problem. No one acknowledged a cause. But the tempo of the organization changed. And when tempo changes without explanation, it means uncertainty has entered the system. I noticed it most clearly in conversations that happened around me, but no longer through me. Side glances during meetings, pauses before answering questions. The subtle recalibration of tone when leadership spoke about tooling, compliance, or visibility. The language grew careful, where before people spoke casually, sometimes carelessly, about internal monitoring. Now every sentence arrived padded with qualifiers. Within scope, as permitted, aligned with updated guidance. Updated guidance. That phrase appeared everywhere, even before the guidance itself did. IT's initial check-in message evolved into something more structured. The follow-up invite included multiple attendees this time, still cordial, still professional, but no longer informal. I accepted without comment. During the meeting, I could feel the shift immediately. Not hostility, not defensiveness, but vigilance. The kind of people adopt when they know the ground beneath them has changed, but they're not sure how much. They asked how my workflow had been affected by recent changes. They asked whether I felt adequately informed. They asked if there were any misalignments I wanted to surface. Every question was an invitation. Every invitation was also a test. I answered plainly, narrowly. I didn't editorialize, I didn't accuse, I didn't reveal what I already knew. I'm still reviewing how recent changes intersect with existing policies, I said at one point. That sentence did more work than any accusation could have, because it signaled awareness without exposure, knowledge without threat. It told them I was not confused, but I wasn't yet revealing my hand. The meeting ended politely, too politely. After that, changes began to ripple outward. New documentation appeared in shared folders, dated recently, but written as if it had always been there. Security and monitoring policies were revised with more explicit language. Consent clauses were expanded, definitions were clarified. Nothing referenced the past. Everything pointed forward. That choice, quietly correcting without acknowledging prior overreach, told me exactly how seriously the issue was being taken. You don't revise policy in silence unless you're trying to close a door without drawing attention to what was happening inside the room. Around the office, people sensed something was wrong, even if they couldn't articulate it. Conversations drifted into speculation. Someone joked that compliance must have finally woken up. Another wondered aloud why certain tools were suddenly restricted. No one connected it to me, and that anonymity mattered, because it meant the focus stayed on the behavior, not the messenger. At the same time, I began to feel a subtle shift in how I was treated. Not elevated, not singled out, just accounted for. My input was solicited earlier in discussions. My questions were answered more directly. When I asked for clarification, it was provided without deflection, not out of respect, out of caution. That's when it became clear. The organization had entered a phase where it no longer felt safe, assuming my silence meant consent. And that realization didn't empower me in a loud way. It constrained them, which in many systems is far more impactful. I didn't feel vindicated watching this unfold. I felt something quieter, confirmation. The kind that doesn't thrill you, but steadies you. Because consequences weren't coming for individuals. They were reshaping behavior. And once behavior changes, there's no returning to the version of reality where none of this mattered. Panic rarely announces itself with raised voices. In professional environments, it shows up as overcorrection. That was the phase we entered next. At first, the company tried to smooth things over with a process. More checklists, more approvals, more carefully worded emails that said very little while taking up a lot of space. The intent was obvious. Regain control without admitting loss of it. But control, once destabilized, doesn't come back through polish. It comes back through trust. And trust was no longer fully available. I began to notice how often leadership revisited the same topics in different meetings, as if hoping repetition would reassert authority, monitoring, security, compliance, each time framed slightly differently, each time with more caution. What had once been assumed was now being justified. That alone told me they understood the gravity of what had surfaced, even if they hadn't yet named it aloud. Then came the mistakes, small ones at first, inconsistencies between documents, language in one policy contradicts another. A consent clause was added in one place but is missing in another. These weren't catastrophic errors, but they were visible to anyone paying attention. And I was paying attention. More importantly, I wasn't the only one anymore. People started asking questions. Not accusatory ones, curious ones. The kind that surfaces when employees sense that rules are being rewritten mid-game. Was this always the case? Did this apply before or only now? Do we need to sign something new? Each question forced a response. Each response narrowed the room for denial. That's when I saw the first signs of real unease. Meetings grew tense in a quiet way. not confrontational, controlled. Smiles that arrived a beat too late. Careful phrasing where confidence used to be. I wasn't central to these conversations. I didn't need to be. The truth had already detached itself from me and entered the system. And once that happens, damage control becomes reactive by definition. There was an attempt to reframe the narrative. Leadership began emphasizing intent over impact. The tools, they explained, were introduced to protect company interests, to improve efficiency, to ensure compliance. The words were reasonable, familiar, but intent doesn't erase process. And it certainly doesn't substitute for consent. That distinction became impossible to ignore when legal entered the picture. Not publicly, but structurally, new review steps appeared in project planning. Documentation that once required 2 approvals now requires 4. Everything slowed. That slowness was the clearest sign that something had gone very wrong. Organizations don't decelerate unless risk has exceeded tolerance. At one point, a company-wide message went out clarifying employee privacy commitments. It read like reassurance. It was meant to calm. Instead, it raised more questions. People don't need reassurance about boundaries they already trust. I watched all of this from my desk, continuing my work as usual. Not detached, but grounded. I felt no urge to intervene, no temptation to say, this is because of me, because it wasn't about me anymore. It was about the gap between what had been done and what could now be justified. And that gap was widening. I could sense the internal conversations that must have been happening behind closed doors. The attempts to trace how long the tools had been active, who had approved what, whether disclosures had been sufficient. Those are not conversations you want to have after the fact, especially when logs exist, especially when timestamps don't lie. Regret entered quietly, not expressed outwardly, but visible in the way people avoided certain topics, in how quickly discussions were redirected, in the careful avoidance of words that had once been used casually. Screen disappeared from the vocabulary entirely. So did recording. By this point, it was clear that no corrective action could fully undo what had already occurred. Policies could be updated, practices could be changed, but the past couldn't be reconsented to. That's the part organizations struggle with most. Understanding that procedural fixes don't erase ethical breaches. You can't retroactively ask permission, and you can't unknow what has been discovered. There was a moment, brief but unmistakable, when I realized they understood this, too. It came during a meeting I wasn't even meant to attend, one I joined only to provide operational context. The discussion stalled on a detail that shouldn't have mattered. No one wanted to decide. Everyone was suddenly aware that decisions had consequences now. That awareness, that hesitation, was the point of no return. From there, the question was no longer, can this be fixed? It was, how do we live with what can't be undone? And in that question, panic finally revealed itself, not as chaos, but as containment. An effort to box the issue in, to limit exposure, to ensure nothing else surfaced. But systems remember, and people do too. By the time the organization accepted that this wasn't a misunderstanding to be smoothed over, but a violation that had already reshaped internal trust, the window for quiet resolution had closed. Not because of escalation, because of timing. It was too late to make. It never have happened. And everyone involved knew it. The confrontation didn't happen when I expected it to. There was no dramatic summons, no urgent calendar invite marked important, no late night call asking me to jump on quickly. Instead, it arrived disguised as routine. An email appeared one morning, polite, carefully worded, almost gentle. A request for a conversation, framed as alignment, framed as closure, framed as mutual understanding. By then, I understood the language well enough to hear what wasn't being said. They wanted certainty, not about what had happened, they already knew that, but about how I was going to handle knowing it. The meeting room was small, neutral, chosen, I suspected, because it felt non-threatening. There were 3 people present, someone from IT, someone from compliance, and someone senior enough to matter but distant enough to remain composed. No HR, no legal, not yet. That absence told me this wasn't about discipline, it was about containment. I sat down, placed my notebook on the table, not the one with evidence, just a plain one, and waited. They began, carefully, They thanked me for my diligence during the audit, for my professionalism, for my attention to detail, compliments that arrived late but precisely where they thought they might soften the ground. Then came the pivot. They spoke about internal tools, about visibility, about security posture, about intent, always intent. They used phrases like not clearly communicated and evolving practices, passive constructions, no subject, no ownership. I let them speak. Silence at this stage wasn't a strategy anymore. It was gravity. Eventually, the compliance lead paused and looked at me directly. Based on your background, they said, we wanted to understand what you observed and how you interpreted it. That was the opening, not for emotion, not for accusation, for precision. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lean forward. I didn't gesture. I simply opened my notebook and slid a single page across the table. It wasn't everything, just enough. A clean timeline, timestamps aligned with system behavior, correlated with my activity, annotated minimally. Then I spoke. I didn't interpret anything, I said calmly. I verified. The room changed in that moment, not dramatically, but decisively. The air thinned, people sat back slightly as if recalculating distance. They looked at the page, then at each other. No one interrupted me. I explained briefly how I noticed the behavior, how I confirmed it, how I cross-checked it against existing policy. I used the same tone I used in audits, neutral, precise, unemotional. I didn't use the word violation. I didn't have to. Eventually, someone asked the question they'd been avoiding. What would you like to see happen? That question carries power if you answer it emotionally. It carries finality if you answer it clearly. I want acknowledgement, I said, not reassurance, not reframing, just acknowledgement that my screen was recorded without my consent and that it shouldn't have happened. No demands, no threats, no escalation. Just a boundary, stated plainly. There was a pause. Then finally the IT lead spoke. Not defensively, not confidently. Measured. Yes, they said, your screen activity was captured. And yes, we should have been clearer about that. It wasn't an apology, but it was an admission. An admission, once spoken aloud, rearranges everything. I nodded once. That was it. No gloating, no relief, no follow-up speech. The meeting ended shortly after. They thanked me again, told me they appreciated my professionalism, assured me changes were already underway. I left the room exactly the same way I'd entered it, calm, upright, unrushed, because confrontation doesn't need heat to be effective. Sometimes the quietest room is where the most irreversible truths are finally spoken. What surprised me most afterward wasn't how the company changed. It was how little I needed them to. Once the truth was acknowledged, out loud, without qualifiers, I felt something release inside me. Not anger, not vindication, tension. The kind you don't realize you've been carrying until it's gone. I didn't become louder after that meeting. I didn't suddenly assert myself in every conversation or rewrite my professional identity overnight. That would have been another performance, just in a different direction. Instead, I became clearer. I understood, finally, that my quiet had never been the problem. My silence had only become dangerous when it was assumed to mean consent. Now, I knew the difference, and so did they. I still work methodically. I still listen more than I speak. I still choose precision over volume. But the way people respond to that has changed. Not because I demanded it, because boundaries were named. My role is no longer just reliable. It's defined, scoped, respected. When new tools are introduced, I'm briefed. When policies are updated, I'm consulted, not ceremonially and practically. And when something doesn't sit right, I don't rush to explain it away. I pause. That pause is different now. It isn't self-doubt, it's an assessment. I've learned that you don't have to become aggressive to protect yourself. You don't have to perform outrage to be taken seriously. You don't even have to be believed immediately. You just have to be accurate and patient enough to let accuracy do its work. Outside of work, that lesson has followed me. In conversations, in relationships, in how I listen to discomfort instead of minimizing it. I no longer ask myself whether I'm being too sensitive when something feels off. I ask whether it's being addressed. There's a quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can sit with the truth without needing to broadcast it. From understanding that restraint is not the same as weakness, and never was. I don't carry bitterness from this experience. Bitterness requires fixation, and I don't need that anymore. What I carry instead is discernment. I know how easily lines can be crossed when no one is watching, and I know how powerful it is to watch carefully without announcing yourself. That knowledge has changed me, but gently, not into someone harder or colder or more guarded, into someone steadier. There's a temptation when telling a story like this to look for a clean moral, a warning, a villain, a moment where everything snaps into focus and justice arrives fully formed. Real life doesn't work that way. What happened to me didn't end with applause or punishment. No one was publicly shamed. No dramatic exits followed. The system didn't collapse. It adjusted, quietly, carefully, in ways most people would never notice unless they knew what to look for. And that, I think, is the point. Most ethical failures don't come from cruelty. They come from convenience, from small decisions made in rooms where the people affected aren't present, from assumptions that silence means comfort and that efficiency outweighs consent. What I learned is this: boundaries don't disappear all at once. They erode when no one names them. And naming them doesn't always require force. It requires attention. I didn't win by outshouting anyone. I didn't reclaim my agency through confrontation or public exposure. I did it by staying precise when others were vague, patient when others rushed, and grounded when others tried to smooth things over. There's power in that approach. Not dramatic power, but durable power. The kind that changes how systems behave instead of how stories are told. If there's a takeaway here, it's not trust no one or always assume the worst. It's something quieter. If something feels off, you're allowed to notice it without immediately justifying it away. You're allowed to gather information before reacting. You're allowed to protect your clarity, even when doing so looks like passivity from the outside. And you're allowed to expect consent, not as a courtesy, but as a baseline. I know there are people listening who have felt that same unease at work, the sense that something isn't quite right, but you can't point to a single moment or sentence to explain why. If that's you, I hope this story reminds you that awareness doesn't have to be loud to be effective. Sometimes the most meaningful shifts happen long before anyone else realizes the ground has moved. I'm curious, when was the last time you noticed a small discomfort and chose to listen to it instead of dismissing it? If you're comfortable sharing, and I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments.